Chapter 1: Blood on the Harvest. The wind rustled the scorched remnants of the fields that once fed entire families. Jarek stood at the edge of what had once been his village, now reduced to ash and broken stone. The air was thick with the acrid stench of charred wood and blood, a reminder of the battle fought mere weeks before. In his hand, he gripped a blade with calloused fingers that trembled despite the strength he'd found in himself during the raid. Behind him, the handful of survivors who had rallied to the resistance milled about, cleaning weapons, tending to the wounded, and preparing for the inevitable next attack. "Farmer," called Commander Varl from where he stood atop a mound of rubble, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The title no longer sounded mocking, more like a badge of honor, one that Jarek had reluctantly earned. "You ready for another round?" Jarek swallowed, the taste of ash on his tongue. "Do we have a choice?" Varl's mouth twitched, a fleeting shadow of what might have been a smile. "Not in this life." They had won a victory, yes. But it was one battle in a war that promised no end. The enemy had retreated, but they would be back. The machines, the invaders who had come from the stars, were relentless. Every strike, every skirmish was part of a grand strategy that none of the resistance fighters fully understood. What they did understand was that survival demanded sacrifice. "More refugees came in during the night," Mara said, stepping up beside Jarek. Her eyes, sharp and cold during battle, now seemed tired, haunted. "They're looking to us for safety. Food. Hope." Jarek's heart twisted. Hope? How could they offer hope when every day was a struggle just to breathe? "What do we have left to give?" Mara's expression softened, a brief crack in the armor of her composure. "We give them what we have. We fight. Because it's the only thing we can do." He nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. Would it ever be enough? Could they really protect these people, or were they simply delaying the inevitable? Later that day, the campfire meeting. The survivors had gathered around a flickering campfire, its light casting long shadows across their faces. The fire was a rare comfort, a reminder of warmth, of life before the war. Jarek sat close, listening as Varl laid out their next moves. "The enemy is regrouping," Varl said, his voice low but carrying weight. "Our scouts report that they're massing to the north, near the valley. If they march, they'll cut off our supply routes and starve us out." Murmurs spread through the group. The valley was crucial, it provided a narrow passage through which they could move supplies and communicate with other resistance cells. Losing it would be catastrophic. "We have to strike first," Varl continued, his eyes scanning the faces around the fire. "Hit them before they're ready. It's the only chance we have." One of the older fighters, a man named Garrick with a scar running the length of his jaw, spat into the dirt. "You mean suicide?" "It's survival," Varl shot back, his voice like steel. "If we wait, they'll come for us. If we strike now, we have a chance." "A chance to die," Garrick muttered, but he didn't argue further. The truth was clear to all of them. Jarek clenched his fists, feeling the rough leather of his gloves bite into his skin. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't asked for any of this. But neither had any of the others. They had been farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, ordinary people forced into a fight they didn't fully understand. "What do you need me to do?" Jarek asked, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. Varl nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. "You'll lead a team to disable their forward defenses. It won't be easy. But if we can breach their perimeter, we'll have a shot at taking out their command unit." Jarek felt the weight of the task settle on his shoulders. He wanted to refuse, to run, but the faces around him, hollowed by hunger and loss, kept him rooted in place. He had to do this. The refugees' plea. Before the resistance fighters set out, Jarek found himself drawn to the stone barn where the refugees had taken shelter. The place was cramped, filled with the sickly sweet smell of unwashed bodies and the quiet whimpers of children. One of the elders, a frail woman with trembling hands, approached him. "You're going to fight, aren't you?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and hope. "Yes," Jarek said simply. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I lost my son to those monsters. My daughter and I barely escaped." You must make them pay. Jarek's throat tightened. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man trying to survive. But these people needed someone to believe in. I'll do everything I can, he promised, the words heavy with the weight of what they demanded. The woman touched his arm, her grip weak but determined. May the gods watch over you, she whispered. Jarek walked out of the barn with her words echoing in his mind. It was a weight he hadn't asked for, but it anchored him. He couldn't let them down. Not now. Preparing for battle. The hours leading up to the raid were filled with tense preparation. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened, armor patched and fitted. Jarek's hands moved on autopilot as he prepared his gear. He could hear the murmurs around him, men and women whispering prayers, sharing last words, holding each other close. He tried to block it out. He couldn't afford to think about what might happen if they failed. Mara approached, her expression unreadable. She handed him a small pendant, a crude carving of a hawk, worn smooth by time. My brother made this, she said quietly. He believed it would bring him luck. Did it? Jarek asked, his voice hoarse. He died wearing it, she replied, a bitter smile playing at her lips. But I figure you could use it more than I do. Jarek stared at the pendant, feeling its weight in his palm. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Mara said, turning away. Just make sure you come back. The night raid. Darkness cloaked the land as Jarek and his small team moved through the underbrush. Every step was a gamble, every breath a risk. The enemy's camp was well guarded, their patrols precise and deadly. But Varl's plan hinged on surprise. Hold, Jarek whispered, raising a hand as a patrol passed mere feet from their position. He held his breath, willing his heart to quiet. When the patrol moved on, he signaled for the others to continue. Their target was a cluster of pylons emitting a low, pulsating hum, part of the enemy's defensive network. If they could disable it, the resistance would have a chance to breach the camp. Jarek, Mara hissed, crouching beside him. You sure about this? No, he admitted, a wry smile playing on his lips. But that's never stopped us before. Together, they crept closer. The pylons were guarded, of course, two mechanical sentries with glowing eyes that scanned the darkness. Jarek motioned to his team, indicating their approach. They split up, each moving with careful precision. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. Jarek lunged at one of the sentries, his blade striking sparks as it connected with metal. The machine retaliated, its movements fluid and deadly. He dodged, feeling the rush of air as its arm passed dangerously close. With a surge of adrenaline, he drove his blade into a gap in its armor. The sentry spasmed, sparks erupting from its joints, before collapsing. One down. Mara called, dispatching the second sentry with practiced efficiency. But their victory was short-lived. An alarm blared, a harsh, grating sound that sent a chill down Jarek's spine. Move, he shouted. They worked quickly, disabling the pylons while the rest of the team held off reinforcements. Sweat poured down Jarek's face as he cut wires and smashed components. The ground shook as more enemy forces closed in. They were outnumbered, outmatched. Almost there, he grunted, severing the last connection. The pylon sputtered and went dark. We need to go. Mara yelled, her blade slick with blue light from the enemy's fluids. Jarek nodded, his chest heaving. They ran, weaving through the chaos, every step a fight for survival. The night was alive with fire and fury, but they pressed on. There was no turning back. When they finally reached the edge of the camp, Jarek collapsed, gasping for air. Behind him, the sounds of battle continued, but they had done their part. The perimeter was breached. Jarek, Varl's voice crackled over the comm. You did it. We're moving in. Jarek closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. He had fought, killed, and bled. And it wasn't over yet. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than despair. He felt purpose. Get ready, Mara said, her voice soft but unyielding. They'll be back. Jarek nodded, gripping his blade tighter. I know. They would fight. Because that's what they did. For the fallen. For the living. For hope. Chapter 2, Shadows of Fire. The night sky was still streaked with the fiery remnants of battle when dawn broke over the valley. Jarek stood on the rocky outcrop overlooking the smoldering remains of the enemy encampment, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The enemy's pylons lay dark and shattered, their defensive grid rendered useless. But the cost had been high. Too high. Beside him, Mara leaned heavily on a blood-stained spear, her face pale and drawn. "We did it," she said, her voice hollow. "But it doesn't feel like a victory." Jarek didn't respond. Instead, he scanned the battlefield below, his eyes lingering on the bodies of fallen comrades. The resistance had managed to breach the enemy's defenses, but they had paid for every inch of ground in blood. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. It wasn't supposed to be like this. None of them were supposed to be here, ordinary people dragged into a war they barely understood. Jarek. Commander Varl's voice broke through his thoughts. The older man's armor was scorched, and a makeshift bandage wrapped around his left arm. He moved with the stiffness of someone who had seen too many battles and knew there were more to come. "We need to move." "Already?" Jarek asked, exhaustion weighing him down. "Can't we just breathe? For a moment?" Varl's eyes softened, but only for an instant. "If we stay, we die. They'll be back with reinforcements. Stronger, angrier. We need to regroup, fortify, and be ready." "Ready for what?" Mara asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Another fight we can't win?" "Every fight is one we can't win," Varl said, his gaze hardening. "But we fight anyway." The retreat. The resistance moved quickly, carrying their wounded and gathering what little supplies they could salvage from the battlefield. Jarek found himself helping an older fighter named Nara, who had taken a bolt to the leg. She leaned on him heavily, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Don't look so grim," Nara wheezed, managing a pained smile. "I've had worse." Jarek forced a smile in return, though it felt like a lie. "You're going to be fine." She nodded, as if trying to convince herself. "Just get me back to camp, and I'll be dancing in no time." They both knew it was a lie, but it was one worth believing. Step by step, they made their way through the rocky terrain, the weight of survival pressing down on every member of the resistance. When they finally reached the temporary encampment, a hidden network of caves nestled within the hills, relief washed over Jarek. The caves had been prepared long ago as a fallback point, stocked with food, water, and medical supplies. But it was a cold comfort. "Get the wounded inside." Varl barked, his voice carrying over the noise. "We don't know how much time we have." Jarek helped Nara to one of the makeshift medical stations, where a handful of healers, most of them inexperienced volunteers, did their best to tend to the injured. The air was thick with the smell of blood and the muffled cries of those in pain. "You did good out there," Nara said, her grip tightening on his arm. "Keep doing good." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Rest. I'll be back." But as he walked away, the weight of her words settled on him like a stone. Keep doing good. What did that even mean in a war like this? A grim council. The resistance leaders gathered in the largest cave, the flickering torchlight casting harsh shadows on their faces. Jarek stood to one side, listening as Varl outlined their next steps. The enemy would regroup and retaliate. That much was certain. The only question was when. "We have to strike again," Varl said, his voice hard. "We can't give them time to recover." "Strike again?" Garrick spat, his scarred face twisted with anger. "Half of our people can barely stand. We need to regroup. Strengthen our defenses. If we wait, they'll crush us," Varl shot back. "You know that." The two men glared at each other, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Finally, Mara stepped between them, her voice calm but firm. "We all know what's coming. We need to be ready, for whatever that means." Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Each of them knew the truth, there was no perfect solution. No easy way out. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on borrowed time. We'll strengthen our defenses, Varl said finally, his voice low. But we also need to find a way to hit them where it hurts. And how do we do that? Jarek asked, surprising himself by speaking up. We barely survived last night. Varl's gaze settled on him, intense and unwavering. We find their command node. Take it out. It's risky, but if we succeed, we'll cripple their ability to coordinate. Another suicide mission, then, Garrick muttered, but there was no real fight in his voice. Varl nodded. Another mission. But this time, we have to be smarter. We scout, we plan, and we strike only when we're ready. Unexpected visitors. As the meeting broke up, Jarek lingered in the cave's entrance, staring out at the distant horizon. The sky was streaked with red, a reminder of the blood that had been spilled. He barely noticed Mara's approach until she spoke. Thinking about running? He shook his head. No. Just wondering if any of this makes a difference. She was silent for a long moment. It has to. Otherwise, what's the point? Before he could respond, a shout echoed through the caves. Incoming! Jarek and Mara spun, weapons at the ready. A group of figures stumbled into the encampment, refugees, by the look of them. Their clothes were torn, their faces hollow with hunger and fear. But they weren't alone. One of them, a young man no older than 16, clutched a strange device that pulsed with a faint blue light. Varl appeared, his expression wary. Who are you? The young man stepped forward, his voice trembling. My name is Liran. We were slaves. Forced to work for the machines. But we escaped. This is what they were making us build. He held up the device, and the room fell silent. It was small, unassuming. But the energy radiating from it was unmistakable. What is it? Mara asked. It's a conduit, Liran said, his voice low. A piece of their communication network. We think it can be used against them. Hope flared in the room, bright and dangerous. Varl stepped forward, his eyes alight. Show us. Preparing the strike. Over the next few days, the resistance worked tirelessly. The device, once a tool of their enemies, was repurposed, modified to disrupt the machine's network. It was risky. There was no guarantee it would work. But it was the best chance they had. Jarek found himself working alongside Liran, whose knowledge of the enemy's technology was invaluable. The boy was skittish, haunted by memories of captivity, but his hands were steady as he adjusted wires and recalibrated circuits. You don't have to do this, Jarek said one night as they worked by lamplight. Liran didn't look up. Yes, I do. They took everything from me. Jarek nodded, understanding all too well. We'll make them pay. When the device was ready, the resistance gathered once more. Varl laid out the plan, a precision strike on the enemy's command node, using the device to sow chaos in their ranks. Failure is not an option, Varl said, his voice hard. This is our chance. We take it, or we lose everything. The room was silent, but the resolve in their eyes was unmistakable. They would fight. Because they had to. Because there was no other way. The march to war. As they prepared to move out, Jarek felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Mara, her expression serious. Don't die, farmer. He managed to smile. You too. Together, they walked into the darkness, their blades ready, their hearts heavy. The war was far from over. But they would fight. For the fallen. For the living. For hope. Chapter 3, Flames of Reckoning. The journey to the enemy's command node was fraught with danger. Jarek and the resistance fighters moved through dense forests and rocky terrain, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. The air was heavy with anticipation, and every shadow felt like a potential threat. The conduit device, their one hope of turning the tide, was nestled in Jarek's pack, pulsing with a faint blue light that seemed to reflect the beating of his heart. Beside him, Mara walked in silence, her eyes scanning the path ahead. She had been quieter than usual since they set out, and Jarek knew better than to press her. Each of them carried their own burdens, their own ghosts. For now, all that mattered was the mission. "Keep moving," Varl whispered from the front of the column, his voice low but commanding. "We're getting close." The resistance leader's presence was a steadying force, even as the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on them. The enemy's command node was the heart of their operations, a heavily fortified base surrounded by automated defenses and patrolled by legions of machines. Attacking it head-on would be suicide. But with the conduit device, they had a chance, a small, desperate chance, to sow enough chaos to succeed. The approach. The sun was beginning to set when they reached the edge of the enemy's perimeter. Jarek peered through the underbrush, his breath catching at the sight before him. The command node was a massive structure of black metal, its surface etched with glowing lines that pulsed with an unnatural light. Towers bristling with weaponry loomed over the surrounding area, and patrols moved with mechanical precision, their eyes glowing with cold, unfeeling light. "We'll never get close," Garrick muttered, his voice tinged with despair. "We don't need to," Varl said, his eyes never leaving the target. "The device will disrupt their network. Once it's activated, we move in." "And if it doesn't work?" Mara asked, her tone flat. "Then we die," Varl replied, his voice as hard as the steel in his hand. Quickly. Silence fell. They all knew the stakes. "Jarek," Varl said, turning to him. "You're the one who'll activate the device." Jarek felt the weight of the words settle on his shoulders. "Why me?" "Because you're the one who can," Varl said simply. "You've got the resolve. And because if it goes wrong, we need people who can keep fighting." There was no argument, no room for hesitation. Jarek nodded, his jaw tight. "I'll do it." "Good," Varl said. "Everyone else, be ready." The infiltration. Under the cover of darkness, they moved. Jarek felt every beat of his heart, every ragged breath, as they crept closer to the base. The enemy's patrols were relentless, their glowing eyes scanning the darkness. Twice, they had to freeze in place as a patrol passed within arm's reach. The machines moved with eerie grace, their footsteps unnervingly silent. When they reached the edge of the inner perimeter, Jarek took a deep breath. The conduit device was warm against his chest, a reminder of the power they carried and the danger. He exchanged a glance with Mara, who gave him a small, tight nod. This was it. Jarek pressed the activation switch. The device flared to life, emitting a pulse of blue light that rippled outward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the enemy's defenses flickered, their movements becoming erratic. Patrols stumbled, their lights dimming. The towers sputtered, their weapons going silent. "It's working," Mara whispered, a hint of awe in her voice. "Move." Varl barked. They surged forward, blades drawn, ready to strike. The resistance fighters clashed with the disoriented machines, their attacks swift and brutal. Jarek felt the rush of adrenaline as he cut down an enemy, the weight of his blade driving through metal and circuitry. But the thrill was tempered by the knowledge that their advantage was temporary. "Don't stop!" Varl shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Push through!" The battle raged around them, a storm of metal and blood. The machines fought with desperate fury, their systems struggling to overcome the disruption. Jarek found himself face to face with a towering sentinel, its eyes flickering wildly. It swung at him, and he barely managed to dodge, the force of the strike sending him sprawling. He scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in gasps. The sentinel advanced, its movements jerky but no less deadly. Jarek tightened his grip on his blade, readying himself for a final stand. "Over here!" Mara's voice rang out. She hurled a makeshift explosive, striking the sentinel's torso. The blast sent it reeling, and Jarek seized the moment. He lunged, driving his blade into the exposed core. Sparks erupted, and the machine collapsed with a shuddering groan. "Thanks," Jarek panted, pulling his blade free. "Don't mention it," Mara said, already turning to face the next threat. The heart of the storm. As they pressed deeper into the base, the resistance fighters encountered fierce resistance. The disruption caused by the conduit device was beginning to wane, and the machines were regaining their cohesion. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal, and the ground was littered with the fallen, human and machine alike. "We're running out of time," Varl shouted, his sword flashing as he cut down another enemy. "Jarek, get to the core." Jarek nodded, his chest tight. The core, the central hub of the enemy's operations, was their target. If they could destroy it, they would cripple the enemy's ability to coordinate. But getting there would be a fight to the death. Mara and a handful of fighters flanked him as they pushed forward. The corridors were narrow, the walls humming with energy. Every step was a battle, every breath a struggle. Jarek's arms ached, his body screaming for rest, but he refused to stop. They burst into the central chamber, a vast, cavernous space filled with pulsing energy conduits. At its center stood the core, a massive sphere of glowing light. The enemy's last line of defense awaited them, dozens of machines, their eyes blazing with fury. "For the resistance!" Varl roared, charging forward. The battle was chaos. Jarek fought with everything he had, every strike a desperate bid for survival. He saw Mara fall, her blade clattering to the ground. He fought his way to her side, cutting down the machines that surrounded her. "Mara," he shouted, dropping to his knees. She coughed, blood staining her lips. "Don't stop." Jarek's vision blurred, rage and grief threatening to consume him. He stood, his blade slick with oil and blood, and faced the enemy. They would pay. Every last one of them. "Jarek!" Varl's voice cut through the haze. "The core!" Jarek turned, his eyes locking onto the sphere of light. He knew what he had to do. He fought his way to the core, every step a battle, every breath a victory. When he reached it, he raised the conduit device high. "This ends now," he shouted. He slammed the device into the core. Energy erupted, a blinding light that consumed everything. The machines convulsed, their systems overloaded. The ground shook, and the chamber began to collapse. "Get out!" Varl shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. Jarek stumbled back, the world a blur of light and sound. He felt hands grab him, pulling him to safety. They ran, the walls crumbling around them, the ground shaking beneath their feet. When they finally burst into the open air, the base erupted behind them, a pillar of light that lit up the night sky. Aftermath. The survivors gathered on a hill overlooking the ruins. The enemy's command node was gone, reduced to ash and rubble. But the cost had been staggering. Jarek stood among the fallen, his heart heavy. "We did it," Varl said, his voice raw. "But at what cost?" Jarek didn't answer. He looked at the faces around him, those who had fought, those who had died. They had won a victory, but it felt hollow. Mara's absence was a wound that would never fully heal. But as he looked at the survivors, the refugees, the fighters, the broken but unbowed, he felt something stir within him. They had fought. They had survived. And they would keep fighting. "For the fallen," he whispered, his voice steady. "For the living." "For hope," Varl said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jarek nodded. The war was far from over. But they would fight. Together. Chapter 4, Embers of Defiance. The wind carried the acrid scent of smoke and ash across the hills, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Jarek stood at the edge of the smoldering ruins of the enemy's command node, his gaze fixed on the charred remains of what had once been a fortress of impenetrable power. The fire's glow reflected in his eyes, but he felt none of its warmth. Victory was theirs, but the cost weighed heavily on his shoulders. Beside him, Commander Varl surveyed the destruction with a hardened expression. His armor was battered and streaked with soot, and a fresh gash ran along his forehead, but he seemed almost untouched by the exhaustion that gripped the others. He placed a hand on Jarek's shoulder. "You did well, Jarek." "We all did." Jarek nodded, but his throat was too tight to speak. His eyes drifted to the makeshift graves scattered around the hilltop, hastily marked with stones and scraps of wood. Each one represented a life given in the fight for freedom, a life that would never be reclaimed. She would have been proud, Varl said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Jarek swallowed hard. Mara's grave was among them, marked by the pendant she had given him, the small carving of a hawk now resting atop the stones. He had placed it there himself, the weight of it pressing down on his chest. "I hope so," he whispered. "There's no time to rest," Varl continued, his voice hardening. "The machines may be reeling, but they're far from defeated. We need to regroup and plan our next move. Where do we even start?" Jarek asked, the enormity of the task threatening to crush him. "By rebuilding," Varl said. "One step at a time." The return to camp. The journey back to the resistance camp was somber. The survivors moved in silence, their bodies worn and their spirits frayed. They carried the wounded with care, their movements slow but steady. Every step was a reminder of the sacrifices they had made and the battles yet to come. When they reached the camp, a network of caves and makeshift shelters hidden deep within the hills, the refugees who had stayed behind greeted them with a mix of relief and trepidation. News of the victory had already spread, but so had word of the losses. An older woman approached Jarek, her face lined with worry. She was one of the refugees he had spoken to before the raid, the one who had asked him to make the enemy pay. She touched his arm gently. "You came back." "Some of us did," Jarek replied, his voice rough. She nodded, understanding. "Thank you." The words felt hollow, but he nodded anyway. Gratitude was a scarce commodity in this war, and he had no right to reject it. Rebuilding and reflection. Over the next few days, the camp became a hive of activity. The resistance fighters worked tirelessly to fortify their defenses, patch up their wounds, and tend to the survivors. Jarek threw himself into the work, finding solace in the rhythm of labor. He repaired weapons, built fortifications, and helped dig new trenches. Anything to keep his mind occupied. But at night, when the fires burned low and the camp fell quiet, the weight of everything crashed down on him. He would sit by Mara's grave, the pendant glinting in the firelight, and talk to her as if she were still there. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he admitted one night, his voice low and broken. "Every step forward feels like a step deeper into the darkness." There was no answer, of course. But somehow, speaking the words out loud made the burden feel a little lighter. A meeting of allies. On the 5th day after their return, word came of visitors, emissaries from another resistance cell operating in the Southern Territories. The news spread quickly, and by the time the visitors arrived, the entire camp was buzzing with anticipation. Jarek stood near the back of the crowd as the emissaries dismounted from their horses, three figures clad in battered armor, their faces hardened by war. The leader, a tall woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, stepped forward and met Varl's gaze. "Commander Varl," she said, her voice strong and confident. "I am Ilara, leader of the Southwind Resistance. We've heard of your victory." "News travels fast," Varl replied, his expression guarded. "What do you want?" "To join forces," Ilara said without hesitation. "The machines are regrouping. We have intelligence that suggests they're preparing a counterattack, a force larger than anything we've faced before." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jarek felt a chill run down his spine. The thought of facing an even greater enemy force was almost too much to bear. "We need to strike before they're ready," Ilara continued. "Together, we have a chance. But divided, we will fall." Varl's eyes narrowed. "And what guarantee do we have that you won't turn on us the moment it suits you?" Ilara's gaze didn't waver. "No guarantees. Just the promise that we will fight and bleed alongside you, for as long as it takes." Silence hung in the air. Finally, Varl nodded. "Then let's talk." The strategy. The resistance leaders gathered in the central cave, their voices low but urgent. Ilara's intelligence was grim. The machines were amassing a force in the north, their objective unclear but their intent unmistakable. If left unchecked, they would crush everything in their path. "We have to strike at their supply lines," Ilara said, tracing a route on the map spread out before them. "Cut off their resources, weaken their forces before they reach full strength." It won't be enough, Garrick said, his voice grim. They'll adapt. They always do. That's why we hit them hard, Ilara replied. Sabotage their infrastructure. Disrupt their movements. Make them bleed. The room fell into tense discussion. Jarek listened, his mind racing. The plan was bold, risky. But it was their best chance. Jarek, Varl said, pulling him aside as the others argued strategy. I need you to lead a team on one of these missions. Jarek felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. Why me? Because you've proven yourself, Varl said. And because the people believe in you. People shouldn't believe in me, Jarek muttered. I'm just a farmer. Not anymore, Varl said, his voice firm. You're a leader. Whether you like it or not. The mission. The plan was simple in theory, but execution was another matter entirely. Jarek's team would infiltrate a machine outpost, a key hub for transporting supplies to the main force. Destroying it would cripple their enemy's logistics, at least temporarily. Mara's absence was a wound that hadn't healed, but Jarek couldn't dwell on it. He had a mission to lead and lives depending on him. His team consisted of familiar faces, men and women who had fought beside him before. Each of them knew the risks. Each of them had chosen to fight anyway. As they moved through the forest, Jarek felt the weight of their trust pressing down on him. He couldn't fail them. Not again. The outpost loomed ahead, a structure of dark metal, guarded by patrols and automated defenses. Jarek's heart pounded. This was it. Positions, he whispered, signaling for his team to spread out. They moved like shadows, silent and deadly. The first strike was swift, a coordinated assault on the patrols. The machines fell quickly, their systems unable to react in time. But the element of surprise wouldn't last. Set the charges, Jarek ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. His team worked quickly, placing explosives along the structural supports. The air was tense, every moment stretching into eternity. When the final charge was set, Jarek gave the signal to retreat. But as they moved to withdraw, the ground trembled. A massive figure emerged from the outpost, a war machine unlike anything they had faced before. Its eyes burned with a cold, merciless light. Fall back! Jarek shouted, his voice hoarse. The war machine roared, its weapons unleashing a torrent of fire. Trees exploded into splinters, and the ground erupted beneath their feet. Jarek dodged, his mind racing. They couldn't fight this thing head-on. They needed a plan, and fast. Over here, he called, leading the war machine away from his team. It followed, its footsteps shaking the earth. Jarek's pulse pounded. He was outmatched, outgunned, but he had to buy them time. He led the machine into a narrow ravine, its massive form struggling to maneuver. Jarek climbed a rocky outcrop, his breath ragged. Come on, he muttered, gripping the detonator in his hand. Just a little closer. When the war machine was directly below him, he pressed the switch. The charges detonated, shaking the ground with a deafening roar. The ravine collapsed, burying the war machine in tons of rock and debris. Jarek stared at the rubble, his chest heaving. He had survived, barely. But there was no time to rest. The mission was far from over. The cost of victory. When Jarek returned to the camp, his team was waiting. They had completed the mission, but their relief was short-lived. The war was far from over, and each victory came with a price. Varl approached, his expression unreadable. You did well. It's not enough, Jarek said, his voice hollow. It's never enough. Varl placed a hand on his shoulder. It has to be. For now. As night fell, Jarek sat by the fire, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought of Mara, of all the lives they had lost. He thought of the battles yet to come. And he made a promise to fight, to endure, to keep the flame of hope burning. Because that was all they had.